Man, we have a show for you tonight. We have so much to cover. We're going to be talking about some introspection. We're going to be talking about some more of the world of Nykos, and we also are going to talk a little bit about the way in which games develop. It's a huge show, lots going on. I'll have a full write-up, of course, in the description, but pardon me. Let me try that again. Good evening, this is Jonathan. We have such a big show for you tonight. I got a lot of stuff to cover. We're going to be talking about some introspection and developing our story. We're going to talk a little bit about the development of the world of Nykos itself and some of the history of arguably one of the most active portions of the world of Nykos of all iterations except for the first. And we also have a lot of information to add to you in terms of a bit of a rant tonight on the Game Master's Soapbox, so watch for that as well. But before we get into that, make sure you hit all the buttons down below, like and subscribe and all of that, and make sure that you watch our YouTube videos, and make sure you subscribe to the Twitch channel if you can, because then you get to watch the show with no commercials whatsoever. So that's a big plus. Also, we have some openings being afforded in our Patreon game, so listen up a little bit later. We'll go into that, but check that out at patreon.com/Nykos and become a member there, and therefore you become a member of the community of Nykos. Before we get going, let's get to the first section. Alrighty. I'm going to save my rant for a little bit later, but my opening salvo today is going to be talking about continuity. One of the questions I get asked most often by players is, how can you keep a campaign as long as you have operating? I mean, it's a 6.5-year arc to go to completion on one of the iterations, and yet you've completed 8 of them so far, and you're now a third of the way through the 9th. How do you keep that going? And the way you maintain continuity is keep players jumping, keep players asking, and keep players involved, because they are the lifeblood. No matter what you do as a storyteller in terms of being narrative in your process or expository in your process, it's really the interaction between the players and the story that matters the most. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on in today's episode. I just wanted to make sure you knew that the reality is that the stuff's coming at you fast. And so the opening salvo from time to time will be really heavy, and I'll have a full monologue planned out. Hey, there's Professor. Welcome. You caught me early in the morning, late at night. So here we are. Glad to have you with us. Alrighty, so we are moving on to the one of the more interesting parts of the show, and that is Just Another Day. And we are doing Just Another Day in Moriah, or Moriah. It depends if you want to pronounce it that way, because in later iterations, it became known as Neo-Moriah. It's currently been reverted back to the old name because we actually spent an entire iteration away from there. And so we will be talking about the development. If you notice in the map of Moriah compared to the other areas of the map around it here on the Nykos map, you'll notice that there are a lot of empty spaces, and that fundamentally are unmapped spaces in this iteration. The other areas that you see to the left and to the right have been at least visited to some extent during this iteration already, but Moriah, other than the city itself, hasn't been explored too much, and we'll get into all of that going forward. So, what is Moriah? Well, when Moriah was first devised as a portion of the map, it was in the center of something known as, this collective area was known as the Southern Wastes. And it had been determined that some great devastation had occurred prior to the players entering this zone. And in the second iteration, that far back, yes, there were players who were already starting to move beyond the boundaries of my initial map. And it was in that case, Thank you for checking with us, Professor. We will get to that in particular. Got an entire section for you on that, and it's really going to be a good one. So thank you for being here. And here's the truth of it. I started playing in 1974 as an 11-year-old. I didn't know anything about world building or anything, but I had played literally 2 game sessions. I had only played twice, and that was with my buddy's Grandpa Dave. Now, at the time, I didn't know it, but Grandpa Dave was Dave Arneson, one of the 2 guys that designed Dungeons and Dragons, and it was probably close to a decade later before I saw him again. He literally came out, was visiting with his children, and his grandchildren were my friends, and so Derek led me to get to know his Grandpa Dave, and Grandpa Dave ran 2 game sessions for me. Now, at the time, he was the only person on the planet that I know of that had polyhedral dice. As far as I was concerned, in my small world, I was born in Kansas and was in Colorado at the time. But when I started playing those 2 sessions, I was hooked. Now, in all candor, I had a bit of literary experience at that point. I had read The Hobbit as a child. Of course, I'm only 11, so child. I was pretty young to be reading a book like that, I suppose. But I was a voracious reader and also had seen the Rankin Bass, I think it was Rankin Bass, Lord of the Rings. No, Dungeons and Dragons. I know, I'm getting away. I'm flustering myself. Well, it was The Hobbit that I had seen, the Rankin Bass Hobbit with the Frodo of the... No, that's the wrong movie. Oh, I'll get to that. We'll get to that exactly. So we'll come to that answer. I can answer that specific question in today's Soapbox. We'll talk about that in particular. So thanks for bringing that up. We will do that. Also, this portion of the show, it leads directly into the world in around 80 days, and that's specifically when we will do some world building in particular. But in Moriah, in the second iteration, my players were starting to expand the boundaries of the world, and I had to think fast. In 74, I was, like I said, brand new. I didn't even know where to get the materials. I didn't have dice. There wasn't an official game store yet available. There was a store that carried hobby materials, wood and graphic paper and pencils and hex paper and stuff like that. And so I picked up some pages of hex paper, and I created over the summer between 74 and 75, the summer of 74, I guess it was the summer of 75, I actually wrote out the map, and the first copy that I still have that has dates on it is 1978. So the map was fully complete by 1978. But to be honest, I took advantage of something, and if you don't know this, if you can get access to a Dungeon Master's Guide from Advanced D&D, so this would have been what is considered to be pre-second edition, but the old book with the Ifrit on the cover, in the back, scrolled away in the near the index pages, is an automatic generator, and you can use that random generator. It's a percentage dice rolling system, and you're able to build in literally all of the hexes. And that's fundamentally what I did, is I drew an outline of a continent, and then I randomly rolled for every single location to figure out what was there at first. And as the players would move into the map, I'd stay ahead of them in making sure the spaces were filled out, much as I'm doing in this case, where if they go to a place, I detail the map and then move on. And in answer to the question about burnout, the biggest thing about burnout is that you have to really give yourself time to feel the burn, so to speak, because I was, even at that point, I was running 1 to 2 to sometimes 3 sessions a week, because I was the only game master. If you think about it, the game was released in 74, the original D&D. The advanced D&D books didn't hit until 74, 75. And so in that time period, we had to just make do with what we had. And being the only game master for Miles Around, I had players from my age, 11, 12, all the way up to 50-year-olds that were playing at my table, so to speak. And the interesting thing about it is that the maps back then didn't have grid numbers on them, just like this doesn't. But later I've found mechanisms, and I use one of them to track the spaces on Nycos, so that by knowing the exact hex number, I can assign it a value in terms of what the rarity of a monster, what rarity of creatures will be, a rarity of resources, there will be what rarity of minerals there might be, and so on. And so by pulling on a random generator, it made it quick to build the maps. So I was able to fill in what was going on and stay ahead of my party members until such time as I had the map fully completed. Now, ironically, I intended to also create at that time a map of the Everdark, or the ground, the area beneath the surface, but I didn't. And so to this day, there are only a few smattering maps of localized description of the Everdark. So arguably the surface is far better known than underground. But in that area that was the Southern Wastes, I did have in the center of it, in this bleak emptiness, an ancient ruin. And that's an interesting point, because it was actually a ruin when they found it, but I did not use the city of Moriah in the first iteration at all. And so therefore, there's an intrinsic mystery beneath the depths of the city of Moriah today that is a very curious piece of geography, so to speak, where the players could actually dig deeper than the second iteration of the world. For those of you that are not familiar, the Nykos story, the role-play story of it, is a full 50 years long, because I have not ceased to be a GM since I started. Literally the third week that I knew about the game, I was already being the storyteller, because there wasn't anybody else. And while that sounds like a horrible way to play, nonetheless, it meant that I stayed on the forefront of what was developing, not in terms of what the companies were doing with it. There wasn't a lot of superstructure that way, but the concept of staying ahead of the rules mechanisms. Let's see, I just find it over and over through my 2 years of gaming, I can start campaigns strong, but it's around the midpoint that it gets hard. That is what we're going to cover today in particular. They say you've nailed it. It's actually that what I call the introspection point. It's what I call your perception check. So we'll be to there in a bit. But the iteration 2, Moriah was already a ruin, and therefore the play style was very survivalist. The equipment and the gathering of gear had to be done in the occupied areas beyond the map. And so as they moved into the area towards the ancient city, they were running out of materials. As a matter of fact, several of my groups had to make several forays before they finally attained the city. And when they got there, they found that the secrets hidden within the city. Yay! Where's my bell? Welcome, welcome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Glad to have you with us. All right. Yay. My bell's not very ringy today. I don't know why. Here we go. Silly thing. All right. So the process, therefore, in that second iteration was to discover the locations of literally the beginnings of artifacts in the world of Nykos. Now, the first iteration had taken 5.5 years, and my players were certainly playing with pieces that might consider to be classic artifacts, stuff that was described in Dragon magazine in its early years and that kind of thing, and things that I could pick up from Judges Guild was a company that produced property back then, a very inexpensive, fundamentally TSR knockoff material, but it was usable with the D&D rules. And that iteration they gathered the information and the first of the artifacts, and from that they also found the very first mystery, the first portion of what is now known as the purpose. In the campaigns of Nykos, as you are progressing through the iterations, there is a document that you discover early on that's called the purpose, and soon every adventuring group, because they are of a special culture, we'll talk about that when you talk about the injunction later, but the enjoined therefore get this purpose and are told these are the things that must happen for an iteration to complete. And so they are endeavoring to check off these boxes. Well, the original prototype of that was discovered in Moriah, and they didn't spend a lot of time in the city. Hence, the area around the city didn't get mapped very far. But what they did do is that they established that Moriah was going to be the place they would have to bring all of those artifacts back to complete the iteration. And so the city of Moriah ends up in the second iteration being the ground zero for the final battle of that iteration. Move forward to the third iteration. The adventurers now have spanned out and are looking for the other artifacts. They realize that in order to conclude that iteration, they needed to complete gathering the pieces of the artifact. And the clues to that are separate, and it's an interesting note. Those of you that are watching this that are in my gamer base right now, just to let you know, someone has gotten the actual outline of the locations of the artifacts. So that piece of the puzzle is now available to the adventuring groups if they can get to coordinate with each other and find each other literally on the map. Now, what I'm talking about, that may sound completely strange to most people, but I'm running at this point 6 campaigns in Nykos contemporaneously, which means they are public and private RPG groups of between 3 to 7. I've got one group that's 10 players at the same time working on a piece of the purpose without knowing what the other groups are doing. And so just recently they have developed through some clever finagling how to gain access to something known as the Raven Gnome Network. Long story there. That's going to be its own episode. But they now have access to the purpose, but they have not yet gotten access to the locations and whereabouts of these items or artifacts of power. But the first of them was discovered in Moriah during the first iteration, or sorry, in the second iteration. In the third iteration, they're now on a global search for them all, which helped to flesh out the rest of the map. And so by 1979, the map was formalized and completed, which I do, like I said, I have the actual dated versions in my drawer back there. But with the discovery of those items of power and bringing them all back to Moriah, they fundamentally reestablished it as a cultural center. So throughout the fourth iteration, Moriah was not only was it a stopping point, but it was actually a bolster point for the campaigns to gain the support and the valuables they would need for traveling into the other areas of the world. It was also then that the first ziggurat was constructed here in the city of Moriah. Easter egg there again for my players. If you are in one of the games and are pursuing the ziggurats, you do know that one is here already because the name Sapphire is listed. But the ziggurat was first built here as a prison. And that's prison, Prison. I have to spell it out because I also have to deal in this campaign with items called prisms with an M, Prism. But in this case, the ziggurat was built as an imprisonment facility. And it was during this iteration that the humans realized they couldn't hold off the enemies, so to speak. And although they had gotten to know many of their other species, they couldn't depend on them to assist them. So in the fourth iteration, they actually built this device for the purpose of gaining assistance by summoning what they thought was a gateway. They thought they were opening a gateway to return to their home, but what they did inadvertently is they opened the gate for external forces, which I used the word daemon. I was kind of clever. I didn't want to get involved with the satanic panic that was going on, so I determined early on that the daemon of Nykos were not going to be the spiritual enemies described in the Dungeons and Dragons material as demons or devils, but instead they were going to be sentient beings of different species types that would come here to try. They were coming for the purpose of trying to dominate the world of Nykos, and the foolish people that were summoning them thought they were drawing them to help them defeat the really greater evils of Nykos, which arguably my players haven't even discovered yet. So just keep that between me and you and the other, thousands of people that'll watch this video. But the city of Moriah did not hold that luster. By the time the fourth iteration had been completed, the daemon were loose, and the city of Moriah again fell to ruin, fundamentally creating the prophetic cycle that led them to be, in the second iteration, a ruin. But there's more of a story than I can go into here as well. So when we move into the fifth iteration, and that's the period of infamy, the champions of the world determined they were not going to resolve any of the complex pieces of the purpose, and simply dominated their local regions. They were fundamentally playing as warlords. This was in the period where games like Lord of War and things like that. No, it's even earlier than that. Pawn of Prophecy, a bunch of the older games. I can't remember all of the names, but they were computer games that were about Lords of Conquest. That was it. They were playing Lords of Conquest. And so they treated the world of Nykos like that. They created little fiefdoms. I had just figured out how to use the hex numbers to associate with ore values. And so they literally began landscaping and mining, and arguably some of the greatest architecture of the world of Nykos was built in that fifth iteration, because the players were taking the incredible treasures that they were gaining from their adventures, and were, rather than building out the infrastructure and building out community, they were focused merely on their own control centers. And so it was in that period of time that the 6 cities of power came to be, as each of the champions chose a different section of the world and literally fundamentally played micro war games until the end of the age. Of course, the age fell in ruin because the daemon had dominated, and the world fell once again into the darkness that began the 6th iteration. In the 6th iteration, the other species of Nykos, who had been suffering at the hands of these daemon, which had been brought to the world by the mortals, decided to take things into their own hands and literally imprisoned and controlled and dominated the human species, so that at the beginning of the 6th iteration, the players that came were literally the only human beings that were not under these dominated positions. And of that crew, all 5 of them were mortals. They were playing human beings. And so it made sense for them to be the ones to try to break this domination matrix, if you will, that had fallen upon the planet. All of that was established by a document I mentioned in the last broadcast called the Pact. And the Pact was actually signed in a city not far from Moriah here. So the players had to move from their original arrival point at Hammerfall I'll have to tell you about that later. But at Hammerfall, from that point, they spread across the map looking for, they wanted to establish the cities of power and recontrol them. They wanted to find the source of this pact and undermine it and liberate humanity from its subjection in this period. And so the sixth iteration was a fundamentally grand battle for the whole time. The concepts of it were being affected by a lot of war movies, a lot of the sword and sorcery type movies, and so it was a lot of swashbuckling and daring do and wondrous advances and adventures throughout the period. And when that iteration finally ended, they had broken the pact, they'd undermined the people that were in power, had liberated the cities of power, and found there was no longer one ziggurat, but rather there were six, and therefore handily used those six artifacts, those ziggurats, to imprison the powers that be. Now, there's more to the story, of course, than that. But moving on into the seventh iteration, little is known about the kingdom of Moriah because the adventuring group didn't even cross the archipelago from Nordlum into Groland. So this entire continent where Moriah is situated wasn't even explored. And so throughout all of that seventh iteration, little is known about what happened here, and even less is now discoverable because of the Revening. The seventh iteration, using a sevenfold wish, basically eliminated all written histories for the world, which was great for me as a game master. I had therefore all the riddles and stuff I could now recycle with impunity because they'd all been destroyed and there was no written copy. So therefore the players could help to discover and reinvent and renovate these documents and restart that part of the lore of Nykos afresh. But it was in that seventh iteration that the players did make their way to Moriah. They did rescue it and prevent it from being overtaken by the Eldrin. There's a whole story in there. And finally, at the dawn of the eighth iteration, the players resolved and rescued the Pony Empress. There's a whole story there that was in control of this regime and returned her to her body as a sorceress and sort of undid the damage of the Revening. So now players have visited the city of Moriah. They've made excavations of the Sapphire Ziggurat. And in the process, they have found a new sort of nemesis in the kingdom of Mercania to the south. The adventure group that did find this information about Moriah are now on an airship far from here. That games group is known as the Skiffborn, and you can follow their antics when I do my Nykos Nightly News on Tuesday nights. I update where each campaign is, and so you get an idea of where that group that's already been here currently has gone. And there are always new groups being formed and such. So we are going to go ahead and move from this portion, but just realize this is giving you a little bit of a snippet on the history of Nea Moria and giving you kind of an idea of what goes on there. All right. Welcome to the World in Around 80 Days. I'm Jonathan, and we are continuing on. And today we have with us Professor Roswin, I believe it says, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm reading out of the side of my eye, so I may not have gotten it correctly. But we are going to be talking about world building and what to do in those points of cultural or ideological burnout. I utilize a mechanism called perception checks. And the perception checks, I will institute these whenever I personally feel like I've lost sight of the story, or I've lost interest in the story, or I'm just worried about what's going on in the future, or the player characters are getting so powerful that I don't know how to counteract that or play into that. And having done this for 50 years, I think I pretty well got a system down. So with these perception checks, we're going to go over them one by one and go over how they can be used to renovate your mind, clear the baffles, so to speak, as my grandpa used to say, or in other words, get yourself ready to restart even if you've been wound down. In some ways, this is like a rescue video. If you're a game master and you've hit the doldrums, this would be the place to go to, because the first thing you need to do is limit your field of view. Do not think about the end of the campaign. Do not think about what's going to happen in 6 weeks. Limit your field of view to what's going on right now in your campaign. If your players are powerful, then consider what that really means. What do those numbers mean? We spoke a couple episodes ago, or in one of my other shows, I believe we talked about the concept that the interconnection between the players and the story are dependent upon the framework, and the story can move around sometimes and seem like you're getting near the end even while the players are still thinking they're at their beginning. And you can actually, by limiting your field of view to only what is the accessible known right now, you can kind of let the rest of the world fade away for a moment. This is important, especially if you are an outside builder working inward. I have an episode, a particular show about nesting eggs. I'm going to remind myself by holding up this particular dice to remind myself, this is up here, this is where you're going to find the connector that will take you to that episode on nesting dolls. And nesting dolls is the concept of building your adventure scale by scale, because when you are at the lowest level, the characters are arguably closest to the ground, so to speak, and all they can think about are what the challenges they're going to face at that level, power level. As the game expands, you're going to want to build the shells beyond that. And some people are top-down builders. They build the big outer shell, and then they try to cram all of this stuff inside of it. What I have found from my experience, when you do that, you simply have to build a larger doll as well, because whatever you think the top scale is, there's something else that might be beyond it. But limit your view. Bring your perception down to what is going on right now. How many characters do you have? Where are they in the world? What kind of real power do they have? Are they subject to governmental concerns? Are there beings out there that are more powerful than them, and the like? And ask yourself a bunch of what I call chicken or egg questions. And what I mean by that is, you can have them go on a travel from point A to point B if that's what you feel is important to the story. But is going on the adventure, or is getting there the adventure? In which case, decide which of these you feel is the most critically important. Because if you want to build the story right where they are, usually you're not in the sense of burnout at that point, because you're flowing with the game and moving along episode by episode just fine. But if they have outrun you and each week you're having to fight to come up with what monsters they want to fight or whatever, then maybe you want to step out a scale and move to another location simply to put yourself back in a position of equity with the players. If they're dominating an area, of course, you could choose to just let them dominate, in which case your game now becomes a service industry product where you're just simply providing them with check blocks for their advancement. I prefer to instead find a place where they are on relatively unstable footing and they have to figure out what they're going to do and where they're going to go with it, and thereby take back the control of the story in terms of your sanity as a storyteller. These chicken egg questions might be, as I said, do you want to travel? Is that what they want? Do they want to explore underground? Do they want to visit other dimensions? Do they want to run a kingdom? Fine. By finding out and considering those chicken egg questions, you can figure out prioritizing methodologies. Now, That's on one side of the scale. The other is you can look at the practicalities of the game in a soup to nuts practicality. What I mean by that, again, this is another phrase my granddad used to use all the time. Look at everything from soup to nuts. He was referring to the full panoply of what you might partake in. So maybe the players want to go on a long quest. You're not ready for them to go on a long quest. So maybe they have to do things like find a wagon, find a driver, find a map maker, find a map, search. I mean, these are all things you could have them doing locally, keeping them where you want them to be, while you're building into the story that which they're looking for. And therefore, you're building their encouragement, even as you're satisfying your own need to do some catch-up work. Conversely, if you have all the ducks in a row for the travel and you want to get that over with, there's a lot of hand-wavium. That's a secret word I use to refer to all the mystical energy behind the world that you can simply wave your hand. Get the phrase hand-wavium. Dig out the hand-wavium and therefore provide them with the opportunity to prepare for the adventure. And you say, okay, you've done all this preparation. I feel like after the first arc or major blah blah of a campaign, I don't know where to take it. That's where the nesting dolls come in. So while you're playing or running one game and you've got everybody excited, since that becomes routine for you, becomes more easy to do for you, take that time to think about, okay, if they've gotten to the here's a great, I'll just give you the Nykos example. So the players decide they need to find one of these shards of the prism. So you do the adventuring and they're going for the shard. Well, what are they going to do when they get a shard? What's it going to do? What's it for? And therefore I'm able to start germinating new ideas about what might happen after while I'm still doing the game for them. The idea is that the burnout occurs when you've spun your wheels creatively to make sure everything happens for a while and something else pops up that brings that to a halt and it's done, and so therefore you didn't have any time to do the prep work to go beyond. Now, truth be told, first iteration, that was a problem I dealt with. And so I know what you're feeling because I felt that way. And here's what I found. When you are playing one series of adventures for a group, they're not necessarily going to ever cross that threshold again, right? So the material that you've used now becomes a block that you can now use for your second iteration. Now, you don't want to do that just one adventure and start over because the players would be privy to it. So you want to expand it, and that's why I ended up with about a 7-year arc, is that I play for a period of time, my players get reach their accomplishments. Like, for example, we just reached our first transition point at just about the 2-year mark of the campaign. The players fundamentally have all retired. Those characters have reached their objectives. One of them was building the prototype of power armor. Yes, it's Nykos. It's more than I can describe. Another player determined that the devastation that had wiped out one of the Eldrin species, they wanted to go and actually rescue the music that had been lost. And so they are, as a minstrel, went on that subquest. Well, that takes them out of the main campaign. But what it does do is it lets them start a new character, still working on the primary objective of the grand arc, the purpose, but the players can take their secondary characters, and either we do one-offs every once in a while where we'll let one of those players put a group together and we go and run on an adventure they need done. But the main primary storyline must continue, and so therefore one group continues that, but other characters retire. And that is what fundamentally the point of burnout is that you've reached the point where the story, you don't know where to go next. So might I recommend you consider taking a look at the world of Nykos. There are many opportunities that players can take to become a part of the community of Nykos, even to the point of taking ownership of a physical hex or two of the actual dimensions of the world of Nykos, build a crossover point, and then they can come and run adventures in the realm of Nykos that are not affecting their home world. That whatever they're doing in their own world is their own, but they can transition and perhaps find new elements of story they want to take home and put into their own. And that's what we're all doing, right? We're all creatives who want to build more. So when that point of burnout occurs, it just means that you've gotten to the point where your power cell is run down. Now, I'm a writer as well as a storyteller, game master, although this is my first love and my primary occupation. I also have written 360 books or so in the last 6 years. And of those, I've only got 10 of them that are under my own name because I'm a ghostwriter. And you think of writers hitting writer's block. Well, what I've discovered is that writer's block literally is that you've got a power cell that's running on the primary story. And if you don't have other story wheels turning, already getting started up on another line, then that first line can actually run out of juice. You've literally used all of its power, and therefore it's drawn down. It sounds like what you're running into. When that happens, your real option is to start a new campaign. Leave that one sitting fallow, unfinished, whatever, and just the players go play this other one. And then when your energy levels come back up, you'll eventually start to think of things that you might be able to do with that other group. In the world of Nykos, it's a little easier because I've been doing it for so long. There is no place on that map that you saw, which I think we counted up as something like 18,000 hexes. And those are 650 square mile spaces. So they're huge. You can avoid the burnout, if you will, because you simply have more new adventures starting all the time. And so you just switch from one to another and to another. Yep. So here's the trick. When you have the long-term campaigns, like, for lack of a better term, I'm going to use the Dungeons & Dragons model, Ravensloft. It's not a good one, not a fun one necessarily, but it is a bit of an adventuresome slog. And at first it's exciting because it's new and different, and the players have to deal with some things they don't have to deal with in normal lore. And so you play with that for a while, and then you realize this is too long of a campaign, we're not going to get finished. Well, have those players find a way out of Ravensloft to go do something else. The Ravensloft story is still there. Arguably, you could make it so that their dimensional space, when they departed, didn't actually change time at all, and therefore that adventure literally froze. So they go do something else, and then eventually you draw them back. Hey, should target the black. Where's my bell? Welcome. Glad to have you with us. Yay. So once you have that burnout feeling, you take a transitional episode or two to drive them literally off the map, freeze that adventure in time, set it aside, go do something else. When your brain starts to unfreeze, you get past that vapor lock, so to speak, you can start to see how pieces might fit back together, and you get excited about that again, and then you transition them back. So that way, both of those adventures now are running, and they're both running at your comfortable speed. And because now you're making that transition on this, patternistic swing. Hey, welcome. This is about all role-playing games. I'm using the references to Dungeons & Dragons as my history is 50 years long with that property. But for more information about myself, as I said, I've been a game master for 50 years. I was the marketing director for GAMA, for the Game Manufacturers Association, and worked with every publisher of every card game, board game, miniatures game, role-play game, anything that wasn't a computer game for a bunch of years. And then I was also the tournament liaison for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card brand. And so I worked with the trading card product, and actually was considered in 2017 to be the best connected man in the games business in an article in ICV2 magazine, I believe. So with that, I've run sci-fi, fantasy, dystopias, westerns, true crime. I've run Toon, the actual game. I've run Paranoia, the actual game. And yeah, I've been doing it a while. I think I probably am the most prolific game master. During all of this, I've also written 6 seasons of adventures for a game store who then now is reselling that property to other game stores to run. So that is 6 seasons at 39 episodes each. So that's about 250 modules. Also uncredited because I sold them to the store. I was clever because I didn't sell any of the stories of Nykos. I only sold franchise product for them. So yes, most of us do like the combat scenes and fight scenes. We will be covering that actually in our next section after we finish the World Around AD. So I'm about a third of the way done here. So I need to try to catch back up. I don't want to lose my place. The next thing to talk about, once you've got the idea of the practicalities, is think in the real. And what I mean by that, and this might help both of you in terms of what you're dealing with, if you think of the adventure as being the reality of the persona, the characters in that game, you give it more gravitas. It feels more real when they think that way. So, for example, I've done an entire episode on non-player characters, what I call NEPs, or non-enjoined persons. And the idea there is that if you treat your non-enjoined persons as people, realizing they have a life, they have a husband or a wife, they've got 3 kids to feed, they do the job that they have in the story for a reason, then the interactions become more visceral and more nominal, more numinescent with the players, because they are seeing the magic of realizing that they're talking to actual personalities, not the cookie cutter NPCs that you can mow down in a video game. These are actually thinking, living beings. I like to think that the movie Free Guy was really somebody looking into the world of Nykos, because the concept is that the NPCs all operate at the level, because guess what? They're all me. So therefore, they are real beings. Now, that also leads to the next question, and that is, when you are doing this perception check, never give yourself permission to not have an answer to a question you're asking yourself, because you are the only source for information about that campaign. So when you come to a point you're going, oh, what do I do next? It's just a matter of expanding your viewpoint, looking at it like as if you've got a camera and swing around to all sides, and look at it in such a fashion that you will find an answer. Because the reality is that you're the storyteller. Nobody else is going to come up with it. And to avoid the burnout is really about always holding on to being ahead of the curve, so that you're always on that leading edge, because you're actually, if you do it as a parallel to, say Christianity, I'm going to probably get struck by lightning for saying this, but the idea is that if you are like the creator and you stay ahead of the creation, always building new and interesting things for them to do, you don't ever run into burnout. So when you do feel that burnout coming, it's more than likely because you're running yourself out of material. You bought a book, you've run through the stories in the book, and now you don't know what to do next. Some great examples of things you can do to cover yourself if that happens. One of which is the yawning. If you're a D&D person, yawning portal. If you're not, then look to Discworld. There's constant flux and changes in the world, because the very nature of the players create the reality. And so all you have to do is grab and hold on to that and attach that back to the players in a constant feedback loop. Now, I will tell you, as I said before, in my first iteration, I did run into the burnout field, but what I found advantageous is the idea of building whole new groups, so that even as one group reaches the end of its arc, you have another group. And ironically, by keeping focused on the other arc, you give your power cell time to recharge, putting my hand in the area you can't see. That your backup powers can recharge on that, and therefore you overcome the very blockage that you saw coming. Next is, when I say always have an answer, that means that just give yourself permission to have it, because you will. The next thing is to get a handle on beyond, and I think this is spot on what you're actually asking about and why I was kind of racing to get through these. When you're talking about getting the handle on beyond, that's literally looking at the structure of infinity. And now I sound like I'm getting all philosophical, and I do that from time to time, so I apologize. But when you are thinking of the infinite, there are three places that we can think of infinity, right? We can think of infinity in terms of space. You could have them adventure in a straight line and never stop forever, right? That's through space. Just go, just keep going, and therefore it's infinite. But that's hard, because then you can't map it back. You can't bring it back to where they were before. You can't even give them things that are relevant. Some players call that a railroad, because you're guiding them down the path, so to speak. The second way we can see infinity is in time, because we all know that our lifespan is finite. So you can say, I'm running a 7-month campaign, and when we reach that time limit, it's done. Where's my bell again? It's done. We're not doing any more. We're going to be moving on to the next campaign, because that one is completed. When you do that, you give yourself permission to stop, recharge, retool, and go again. And that's most common. Most game masters will run for a year, year and a half, maybe 2 on a single campaign. And as mentioned by Shatarga the Black, I hope I'm saying that right. Shatarga's saying that they're running multiple campaigns. And because they're running campaigns, multiples, I don't, they may never hit the burnout because they've got enough going on. I call that juggling plates. I don't know if either of you have ever, or any of you have ever heard of a plate balancer or plate juggler. But back in my day, on the variety shows, from time to time, they'd bring out this specialist in juggling, where he would actually take a dinner plate, put it on a stick, and spin the stick and make the plate wobble and float. And then they would just set up a dozen of these or whatever, and then they do weird juggling acts with them or whatever. But the juggling of plates is really the way you avoid burnout, ultimately, is that you never give yourself time to stop on any one campaign, because you're busy working on all of them. So that's one way. Therefore, when you do start to feel the freeze, you move to another one, work on it more deeply, and then your brain will unlock, and so you'll be able to continue the push me, pull you of creation. But really, it's a matter of getting a handle on beyond. So the two ways I've talked about are space and time. And we have limits on both. But there's a more elegant way, hence what I call the iteration. The concept of infinity being a line that is too long for an individual to pursue, but that eventually comes back to the starting point. And mathematically, all of us know that infinity is found in a circle in the value of pi, because the value of pi is 3.1415 and so on ad infinitum. There's no end to that. And yet, with that as part of the measurement, it brings you right back to your starting point. Now, whether you actually ever hit the actual reset button and start over again is a relative term. In the case of Nykos, they've actually made it completely through the iterations, a total of 6 times. One of the times the players never concluded because they never pursued the elements of the purpose. And in the latter, they actually ended it early through the use of something called the revening. And the revening is a magic that was basically each of the players achieved their paragon level and found ways for each one of them to have a wish. And instead of wishing them singularly for each's desires, they instead linked them all together as one super mega powerful, multi-dimensional, extreme magical effect, and fundamentally were collectively wishing the world of Nykos to revert to its original status. They thought this was going to liberate me as a game master, so I would no longer have to be on what they perceived to be this burden of the cyclical arc. They thought they would fix it by turning it into a straight line. But what they didn't take into account is that they themselves had hurried too quickly and hadn't reached all of the iterations, hadn't reached all of the powers that be of the realms, and therefore there were beings in present and in history powerful enough that if a never spell, so to speak, was enacted upon them, they'd have the ability to combat it, and thus the Revening functionally destroyed all of the written word of all species on the surface of the world of Nykos, of functionally obliterating all written histories. And so they thought that was the same as stopping time. And so to humor them, even though I already had my resolution figured out, again, it goes back to the burn. Had I been in a burnout stage, that could have very easily been the end of Nykos, and I might have started a completely different world after that. But what I did instead is I gave myself enough time by letting them work through how this would work to the point where there was an establishment of these fixed points in time where those points in time had beings powerful enough to prevent the destruction of their personal locale in space-time, and therefore created these torrential and horrific temporal storms that literally were gateways into the points of iteration. Now, most didn't get it at first, but later my players realized that it was my way of preserving the histories, because the players could, in long term, visit all of those storms, regain all of those elemental pieces, and therefore recreate the histories. But that wasn't the choice they went to. Instead, they decided to try to ignore it and live in the now. So it wasn't too surprising when some of those veteran players who were still in the world and enjoying the benefits of not having to worry in their mind's eye about this problem, instead what they realized is that this Revening had not stopped the chronological passage of an iteration, but had simply prevented one of the iterations to end properly. And so therefore, for a period of time, I had groups literally racing against time to finish the 7th iteration before the players that were living in the 8th iteration actually got ahead of them and would have caused all kinds of horrible things in the world. But that was me thinking beyond. And that's really what I'm talking about here. When you get to the point where you're getting into burnout, you're getting into the place where you haven't fully developed your idea of beyond. If you are a person who, as I said, runs one game type only, the burnout point is a great time to try another one of the multitude of roleplay games that are out there. Now, let me take a moment and do a shameless plug. NycosRPG, the mechanism I developed, actually is going to be built with a master book, which is central to all role-playing, regardless of period of time, and 6 separate system books will be brought to bear in that Kickstarter, and therefore you will have the books to cover high fantasy, to cover dystopia, to cover modern-day spies, to cover the Lovecraftian horror, to cover Wild West and superheroes. So with one game mechanism, you'll be able to encompass any of those. And so literally these shifts that I'm talking about could happen within literally minutes, as you could actually pick up and run a separate game with the same characters, the same build, everything, because game build mechanics are streamlined to the max. We'll talk about that perhaps in another video. Or you can go to NycosRPG.com and get a copy of the free downloadable Masterbook Fast Play version. It's like, I think, 11 pages, Masterbook PDF. And you can also download the persona sheet, which is a persona packet, which is how you keep track of the information that your character is defined by. But now let's bring this back. We need to, therefore, now that we've got all of the, we're in that beyond, we're in that infinite space. We now have to focus on the finite. And remember, our finite at this point is that limited view of what's going on in our game. What possible changes could we make in this current change that will make our game more amplified? Maybe players have been saying, oh, I'd like to have a little bit more social interaction. Maybe they say, oh, I get enough talking in town, I want to fight monsters. By getting an idea of pulling back, getting a handle on what's going on beyond, focusing on the finite, you now give yourself the outs. And I use this as actually a poker term, the idea of looking at the number of cards that you would have yet to, quote, create a made hand. The idea is that you leave yourself as many outs as possible. Now, this also is a driving term that refers to don't get yourself jammed up in a traffic jam. Always give yourself an opportunity to go someplace else if something goes bad. But in this case, leaving yourself outs means that you are building your story with the idea of where the off-ramps would be if you needed to bail to go do something else, or if you wanted to change the storyline or whatever. And then finally, the biggest piece of advice I can give to everybody who is a game master comes from the world of music. Now, see, I've gone everywhere today. I've been to the racetrack and every place. But when you are talking about music, I can't remember. I think it was, oh, I'm not going to even guess. It was somebody from Motown, I believe, that said it's as important as playing the tones that you see on the paper that you remember to play the spaces and let the spaces sing. And what that means is sometimes your burnout is actually where the players will pick up some of the rope and start to guide you on where they want the story to go. And while I don't recommend that for any really long length of time, otherwise, as I said, you become a service industry and you're only providing resources to your player base and you're not getting what you want out of the game. Nonetheless, the idea here is that when you let those spaces sing, you're listening to the music, if you will, of infinity. You're listening to the music of what the players want to do, and therefore you're able to reset your position. And once you finish your perception check and you've cleared all these out in your mind, then you're able to start again brand new and fresh every session. Alrighty, that is my addition for you in the world of around 80 days. World in around 80 days. This is, believe it or not, this is a part of world creation, to actually give yourself time as you're building to work through these processes when you feel the burnout coming. So let's go on to the final. We got 2 more sections left. We're still rolling along here. All right. Alrighty, this is the section called Game Master Soapbox, and this is where I tend to wax philosophical or rant like a crazy person. Today, I'm much more on the introspective side, and those of you that aren't aware of my background as a game master with 50 years behind the screen, I've been able to sit where I am right now every week playing games with people and watch what has happened to roleplay games. So let's talk about what has happened to roleplay games. Now, I have to admit right off the get-go, time passes. I know I don't look it, but I'm physically only 17 years old. My son declared himself older than me when he turned 18, and that was 20 years ago. So you can get from that the idea of what the math is. I just will be 62 in the summer coming up, and the reality is that most of the time passes, the game master moves on, the world continues to turn, new game masters come onto the scene that are not from the generation before, but they are new players. They've got different values. The world has changed. When I was a kid, way back when I was a kid, there wasn't even yet Walkman. There wasn't a TI-80 computer, calculator. The computers of the world were the size of houses. ENIAC was one of the big computers of the day. NASA's big computer that helped us get to the moon was another. They were the size of buildings. They were monsters. And the idea of having a pocket calculator, pocket computer, cell phone, forget about it. That wasn't even real. As a matter of fact, the only person that had a really cool telecommunications device was Dick Tracy. He had a watch that had a video screen and a radio, so he could actually see his boss and talk to his boss on his wrist. Not something that we got until the Apple Watch came out long later. But those values and perceptions about values change over time. So what a game master that started when I started found useful or powerful or dangerous in a campaign would not even be understood by the younger game masters. And therefore, each game master generationally would have something that was going on in their world that was different. So, for example, in my age, no tabletop computers. You actually had games that were actually even slower than your traditional board games. They were play by mail. And you would actually write your instructions for your units or whatever, and you would mail them. Snail mail, mind you. 3 days out, 3 to 4 days back, and so once per week you might get lucky and have a turn to play in the game. You think you get tired on a stalled screen or a flashing screen? That's nothing like what I'm talking about. We're talking about not seconds or minutes. We're talking days or even weeks before your turns could be processed. The way we communicate, although you would argue that we have more communication capabilities today, actually suffers. And that's because a lot of communication is one way. One of the things I'm trying to do with my YouTube account is actually create a role play mechanism where we do live role play during the time that we're on Twitch. And then players who see those videos on YouTube can make their comments in the comments section the following week, and then I'll process that information into the game in our story so far part of the next week's campaign. And thereby, I want to become the game master to the world. I want to be able to run, I'm running, as I said, 6 campaigns. During COVID, I was running 10 campaigns every week to keep people from going insane during that crazy time. Of course, it was all done online, and thank God for Discord. It came in about halfway through that as far as my awareness of it, and suddenly we were able to really start to make headway. And the challenge is that because we become communicators in faster formats and unidirectional formats, the seeing people become blinded. In other words, someone who would ordinarily be able to transfer the terms of an event in a week has to do so in an afternoon, or now in minutes. So most of the young don't recognize this because they're living on that edge of the fastest advances, the quickest changes. They're all happening at that leading edge. And so what happens is that they don't realize how inured, how protected they are becoming from real conflict. This is an interesting statistic I heard, and I'm probably going to misquote it, but it generally said that in the period of World War II, 1940s and after, in the United States alone, 50% of the people in the country either were in the war or knew somebody that was in the war. By the time we get to Korea, that's down to 1 in about 200. By the time you go from then down to Vietnam, it's down to 1 in a couple thousand, maybe 3,000. And by the time you get to Desert Storm, it's 1 in 15,000. Now, Desert Storm's almost 30 years ago now. So today's numbers, I think I heard, was 1 in 150,000. So if you know somebody who actually was in a war or actually served, then you are far ahead of the average. And therefore, people of our generation, people of this generation, I should say, since I'm 17. But as children of this generation have not faced the actual dangers and difficulties and challenges that came from that level of conflict, they don't see the pain. They don't see the threat coming. That is what we need stories for. And this is where game masters, to me, fix things. And what has really happened is that the stories have gone away. The people who are now writing the stories are people who themselves did not experience the stories and therefore don't know how to write for the new players. That's why when I look at the Dungeons and Dragons 2024 volume, I'm kind of frightened because I've already read through a bit of it and it has become ineffective in what Dungeons and Dragons was. Professor mentioned that they love the action the most. Dungeons and Dragons, because of the mechanic of hit points, has fundamentally killed the reality or the danger of an action scene. And so therefore it becomes almost a joke. Between the virtually infinite number of hit points a high-level character can have, relatively speaking, and the ability with the 3 strikes rule for the death saves being hedged in the favor of the players, 3 rolls at 50%, pretty good odds you're going to get a success. This leads, therefore, to people think, well, we need to undermine what is there. This is the concept of, what do they call it, innovative deconstruction, or the whatever, or those people that are reaching backward and saying, no, here is the old school rules. We're going to use the old school rules. But the old school rules were of that time and therefore were fundamentally broken in the first place. So there actually is a third path, and it uses a word that sometimes gets a lot of flack, but the word here is integration. And that is to integrate a mechanic where the threat of impending doom is visceral, tangible, and the players can be wary of it, but at the same time provide them with a mechanic that gives them immediate satisfaction and advancement so that they don't have to wait around for the staged advances of a experience point system that only rewards when the game master decides. So the NycosRPG mechanism resolves all this. This is not a sales pitch. I'm not going to go into that, but I will say if you check it out, you'll see that NycosRPG resolves the issue by getting rid of the class structure so that you can utilize magics and do sword play and wear heavy armor. It's not a mechanical issue as it is in Dungeons and Dragons. You don't have to have the class limitations. If you want to learn a particular kind of magic, you can learn that kind of magic. You simply have to find somebody that can teach it. And then finally, the idea of hit points and wounds takes on a more realistic methodology and takes the actual time necessary in real time. But that's a complete separate issue. But the idea is that you integrate the game mechanisms of the past with the stories of the past, but you bring them up to modern date in terms of the game tech that you're using. And NycosRPG is intended to be a saddle that can be placed over any other mechanism. We'll go more into that in a later video, but I did want to get on to the next part because we are nearing the end of my talk for tonight. Okay, finally we reached the end of the matter, and what that means is that we are closing in on the 1.5 hour mark, which is about perfect for what I wanted to get done tonight. So I'm going to take the next 10 or so minutes and give you my final thoughts. We're going to kind of tie things together that we talked about today. So we talked about Moriah and how its existence was tied to an initial mystery. One of the greatest things you can do for your campaign story is don't put a deadline on it, or do put a deadline on it. And what I mean by that is if you know that you have a burnout period of, say, 2.5 years of playing a game, then build that in and say, okay, at 2 years, 6 months, like it or not, we're stopping. Or why not build a mystery into the fabric of the story from the beginning that the story advancement won't itself solve? So the players will help you build out the new solutions to the puzzle as you go along, and therefore you can keep the adventure rolling. So yes, they will eventually find the solution they're looking for, but that might be 3 campaigns from now, because that's as far as you took that before you jumped onto another horse, so to speak, and started writing. I know that I'm talking in long term for some players that might have been as fortunate as to have 3 to 6 months of experience. I could be talking to people that have been playing as long as I have. It really doesn't matter. If you're running into burnout, it's because you're not prepared for that period beyond. So either acknowledge that, stop cold, and start over, which is one way to recharge your batteries, or conversely, constantly have a churn effect by having mysteries that can't be solved in the framework of the story you're telling, and thereby allow it to continue. Now, let me give you also some information about where you can find my materials. Our website is at NycosRPG.com, and there you'll find information on hiring me as a professional storyteller for your game. It also has information on how you can become a part of my local community games here in the Southern California area. Right now I'm running exclusively at Board Games Paradise, Mondays, Tuesdays, and we've got a special Russian roulette, role-play roulette game on Saturdays, where we actually kind of playtest all the different genres that I'm planning for in the future, so that the concept of the system books won't die with just the first 6. Beyond that, if you're looking for lore upon the world of Nykos and want to know a little bit more about this place, this mysterious location, you can check out NycosRPG.info. That's where you'll find that information. You'll also find information at YouTube, on YouTube at NycosRPG. I like the way that they've now made it so that you can just put YouTube/ and then at NycosRPG and be drawn directly to the site. There you're going to find an overwhelming amount of videos to watch. I've been recording videos off and on for about 5 years, and there are some of my original live stream games going way back when I was exclusively running Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. There's also some videos of the Game Masters Academy, which I developed as an idea of how to help you as a new game master learn everything you need to know. If you want to get involved with that program, it's a $47 fee, and that's available at games.official.academy. Don't need any WWs or anything, just games.official.academy will take you there, and you can find out more about it from that location. I also have Facebook at my name and also at NycosRPG, and I also have the big one is our community is built through patreon.com, and at Patreon you can support the building of these master books and the supplements before the Kickstarter, and doing so allows you to gain access to the hard copies, the limited hard copies I do have of the current pre-release edition. No art, but it's the core materials for the master book and Dark Shards in particular, which is the fantasy setting. And of course, you can catch me here on Twitch every Monday through Friday, and generally we're on from 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. But today I had a bit of a late start because of some local drama with my tabletop games groups. But generally I'm creating new material on a daily basis. If you have any ideas for stuff that I should do or topics I should cover, make sure you leave those in the comments so that I can keep track of them and additionally find more information for you as players, because I really do want everyone in the world to get playing games, and I get it, and I think you get it, so let's get other people doing it. I'm Jonathan Albin, and I want to thank you for being here. Thanks to Professor Roswin and to Shatarga the Black. I think I got that right both times. Thank you again for being here. We'll see you all next time, and keep the dice rolling.